Prologue. The dice are cast. The small river before him barely warranted a name. In summer, locals could cross the Rubicon on foot, the water barely reaching their knees. Yet on this January night in 49 BCE, as Gaius Julius Caesar stood at its northern bank, this modest stream marked the most consequential boundary in the Roman world. To cross it with an army meant civil war. To cross it meant there could be no turning back. Caesar had spent the evening dining with friends in Ravenna, displaying his characteristic wit and easy charm. He had excused himself early, citing the need for rest, only to slip away and ride south in the darkness. Now, as the first hint of dawn threatened the eastern sky, he found himself paralyzed by the weight of the moment, an unusual state for a man famous for his decisive action. Behind him lay Gaul, the vast territory he had conquered over the previous decade, transforming himself from a debt-ridden politician into Rome's most celebrated military commander. Before him lay Italy proper, where his enemies in the Senate awaited. They had demanded he surrender his army and return to Rome to face charges that would destroy not only his career, but his very life. Pompey, once his closest ally and son-in-law, now sided with the conservative optimates against him. The air was crisp with winter's bite, and the only sounds were the gentle flow of water and the restless movement of horses and men, thousands of them, belonging to the legendary 13th Legion, waiting in the darkness for their commander's order. These were the veterans who had followed him through the mud and blood of Gaul, who had faced the savage tribes of Germania, who had built a wall around Alesia and won victories that would be remembered for millennia. "Imagine," Caesar murmured to the handful of officers around him, "what miseries the crossing of this little bridge will bring to humankind." Then, with the theatrical flair that had served him so well in the Forum, he added, "Still, we may retreat now. But once we have crossed that little bridge, we must fight it out with arms." The moment crystallized everything that made Caesar both magnetic and dangerous: his flair for drama, his acute awareness of historical significance, and his ability to frame naked ambition as reluctant duty. He had spent a lifetime preparing for this moment, though he could not have known it would come at this unremarkable river. A rider approached at full gallop from the south. The messenger, breathless, reported that additional forces loyal to Pompey were moving north from Rome. Caesar's window of opportunity was closing. The time for philosophical reflection had passed. As his officers watched, Caesar's features hardened into the mask of determination his soldiers knew so well. "Alea iacta est," he declared. "The die is cast." With these words, Caesar spurred his horse forward into the shallow water. The sound of thousands of men and horses following him shattered the pre-dawn silence. The crossing took less than an hour, but it divided history into before and after. The republic that had stood for 5 centuries would not survive the waves that spread from this crossing. This was not merely the story of one man's ambition, though Caesar's ambition would prove boundless. It was the story of a society that had outgrown its political structure, of a republic drowning in its own success, of an empire emerging from the shell of its former self. Caesar would be both its catalyst and its victim, its greatest champion, and ultimately its destroyer. The events set in motion that night would transform Caesar from a brilliant but controversial politician into an eternal archetype, the figure against whom all subsequent rulers would measure themselves. His name would become synonymous with supreme authority, echoing through the centuries in titles like Tsar and Kaiser. The man who crossed the Rubicon would fall to assassins' knives within a decade, but the world he created would endure for millennia. Dawn broke over the Italian peninsula, revealing Caesar's army spreading south along the Via Aemilia toward Rome. The Republic was dying, though few yet realized it. The age of the Caesars was about to begin. Chapter 1. Born to Rule. On the 13th day of Quintilis, 100 BCE, in a modest but well-appointed home in the Subura district of Rome, a child was born who would one day transform the world's greatest republic into an empire. The month would later be renamed July in his honor, though on that summer morning, no one could have predicted such an outcome for the infant Gaius Julius Caesar. The Rome of Caesar's birth was a city of startling contradictions. Its legions dominated the Mediterranean world from Spain to Syria, yet its streets were frequently battlegrounds for violent political gangs. Its temples were clad in expensive marble imported from across the sea, while its cramped apartment blocks regularly collapsed or burned. The city was experiencing growing pains that would eventually prove fatal to its republican system, though for now, the cracks were only beginning to show. The young Caesar's family occupied an unusual position in this tumultuous society. The Julii claimed descent from Venus herself through the Trojan hero Aeneas, and their name carried the weight of centuries of nobility. Yet by the standards of Rome's ultra-wealthy aristocracy, they were relatively modest. They were patricians who lived like plebeians, possessed of impeccable breeding but limited means, a combination that would shape Caesar's political outlook for the rest of his life. His father, also named Gaius Julius Caesar, had achieved some political success, reaching the rank of praetor and governing the Roman province of Asia, but had never attained the consulship, Rome's highest office. His mother, Aurelia, came from a wealthy plebeian family and would prove to be one of the most influential forces in young Caesar's life. Contemporary sources describe her as a woman of intelligence and strong character traits she would pass on to her son, along with an education in rhetoric, philosophy, and the complex web of Roman politics. The boy's earliest memories would have been formed against the backdrop of civil war. When Caesar was barely 4 years old, his uncle by marriage, Gaius Marius, marched on Rome with an army the first Roman commander to ever do so. Marius, a brilliant general from humble origins, had saved Rome from barbarian invasion, but had grown bitter over the aristocracy's attempts to deny him what he saw as his rightful glory. The new man, as his opponents sneeringly called him, would prove to be just the first of many ambitious commanders who would turn their armies against the state. Young Caesar watched and learned as Rome tore itself apart. Marius and his rival Sulla traded control of the city in an increasingly violent series of purges. Political enemies were no longer merely defeated. They were hunted down and killed, their property seized, their families destroyed. The old rules that had governed Roman political competition for centuries were breaking down, replaced by naked power politics. In 86 BCE, at the age of 13, Caesar received his first taste of public responsibility when he was nominated to become the high priest of Jupiter, the Flamen Dialis. The position carried significant prestige, but also came with arcane restrictions that would have severely limited his future political career. Whether by luck or design, he was never formally installed in the role. The gods, it seemed, had other plans for Gaius Julius. The defining moment of Caesar's youth came in 82 BCE, when Sulla finally achieved total victory in the civil wars and established himself as dictator of Rome. The teenage Caesar suddenly found himself in a precarious position. Through his Aunt Julia's marriage to Marius, he was connected to the losing side. Worse still, he was married to Cornelia, the daughter of Cinna, one of Sulla's most prominent enemies. Sulla ordered Caesar to divorce Cornelia. It was not merely a suggestion. Other young nobles who had refused similar orders had been killed. Yet Caesar, showing the steel that would later make him master of Rome, refused. He fled the city, moving from safe house to safe house in the countryside while Sulla's assassins searched for him. The 16-year-old Caesar had chosen his wife over his life. Only the intervention of powerful friends and relatives, including the Vestal virgins, whose intercession no Roman dared ignore, convinced Sulla to spare the young man. In this boy, Sulla supposedly warned those who had pleaded for Caesar's life, "I see many Mariuses." The old dictator's political instincts were as sharp as ever. The episode taught Caesar lessons he would never forget. He had seen how fragile the laws could be when faced with military power. He had learned that political survival sometimes required knowing when to stand firm and when to flee. Most importantly, he had discovered that he possessed uncommon courage, the willingness to risk everything rather than compromise his dignity. these early years shaped the man Caesar would become. From his family, he inherited a combination of aristocratic pride and financial insecurity that drove him to seek glory at any cost. From his mother, he gained the education and political sophistication necessary to navigate Rome's treacherous political waters. From the civil wars, he learned that traditional political rules could be broken by those bold enough to break them. As Caesar grew into young manhood, he began to display the characteristics that would later make him famous: personal courage, political audacity, and an almost superhuman ability to win loyalty from others. He was tall and athletic, with sharp features and intense dark eyes. Those who met him were struck by his energy. He seemed to crackle with ambition and determination. Yet he was also capable of charm when it suited him. He cultivated a refined image, paying special attention to his appearance and dress. His habit of wearing his belt loosely fastened would spark rumors about his character, but it also set a fashion trend among young Roman nobles. Even in this, Caesar showed his genius for turning potential weaknesses into strengths. By the time Sulla died in 78 BCE, the young Caesar had survived his first major political crisis and was ready to begin his climb to power. He had learned to navigate a world where traditional boundaries were breaking down, where military power increasingly trumped political authority, and where personal charisma could matter more than ancient customs. The Republic was dying, though few recognized it yet. But Caesar, shaped by the violence and upheaval of his youth, was perfectly positioned to thrive in the chaos to come. The young man who emerged from this crucible was neither the monster his enemies would later claim, nor the demigod his supporters would make him out to be. He was something more interesting, a brilliant, flawed human being whose ambitions would reshape the world. The die had not yet been cast, but the player was ready for the game. Chapter 2: The Making of a Legend. In 75 BCE, off the coast of Pharmacusa in the Aegean Sea, a group of Cilician pirates were about to make the mistake of their lives. As they seized a rather unremarkable merchant vessel, they found among their captives a young Roman aristocrat who, rather than cower in fear, seemed almost amused by his predicament. When they demanded 20 talents of silver for his release, Gaius Julius Caesar laughed in their faces. "I'm worth at least 50, he declared. The pirates, unsure whether to be angered or impressed by their captive's audacity, agreed to the higher ransom. What followed would become legend. Caesar spent the next 38 days as their prisoner, treating them not as captors, but as subjects. He wrote speeches and poems, forced them to listen to his recitations, and joined in their games, all while repeatedly telling them with a smile that he would return to crucify them all. The pirates, charmed by their unusual prisoner, thought he was joking. He wasn't. The moment his ransom arrived and he was freed, Caesar raised a private fleet at Miletus, pursued his former captors, and captured them. True to his word, he had them crucified, though in a characteristic display of mercy, he ordered their throats cut first, sparing them a slower death. The message was clear. No one who crossed Caesar would escape retribution, no matter how long it took. This episode, occurring when Caesar was just 25, perfectly encapsulated the qualities that would make him Rome's most famous son: his unwavering self-confidence, his ability to dominate any social situation, his talent for turning disadvantage into opportunity, and his ruthless determination to maintain his dignity at any cost. The pirates had seen him as just another wealthy Roman. They learned too late that they had captured a force of nature. Caesar's early career was marked by similar moments of calculated audacity. When Sulla died in 78 BCE, the young aristocrat had returned to Rome, finding the political scene still smoldering from the civil wars. Rather than join the conservative optimates who had supported Sulla, Caesar aligned himself with the populares, the faction that claimed to champion the common people against the nobility. It was an ironic choice for a patrician who claimed descent from Venus, but Caesar had learned from Marius that true power in Rome now lay with those who could mobilize the masses. His first major case as a prosecutor targeted Gnaeus Cornelius Dolabella, a former governor of Macedonia accused of extortion. Caesar lost the case. The defendant was too well connected, but his passionate oratory made him a hero to the common people. More importantly, it established him as a fearless opponent of corruption, willing to challenge the powerful on behalf of the powerless. That this image was carefully calculated made it no less effective. The death of his wife Cornelia in 69 BCE provided another opportunity for Caesar to display his political genius. His funeral oration for her was unprecedented. No Roman had ever delivered such a speech for a young wife. In his grief, real or performed, he connected himself to both the common people, who were moved by his apparent devotion, and to the Marian faction, as he prominently displayed images of Marius during the ceremony. Even in mourning, Caesar never forgot his political objectives. It was during this period that Caesar began to develop his legendary connection with the Roman masses. He borrowed enormous sums to fund increasingly lavish games and spectacles. When he served as aedile, the official in charge of public works and festivals, he arranged for 320 pairs of gladiators to fight in silver armor. The crowds were delighted, his creditors were nervous, his political rivals were alarmed. All of these reactions suited Caesar's purposes perfectly. Yet he was more than just a showman. During his service in Spain as a military tribune, he demonstrated the martial qualities that would later make him Rome's greatest general. At the Siege of Mytilene, he won the Civic Crown, Rome's second highest military decoration, for saving the life of a fellow citizen in combat. The award gave him the right to wear a special wreath at public gatherings, a distinction he used to maximum political effect. Behind these public triumphs lay careful calculation and relentless ambition. Caesar worked tirelessly to build a network of political allies and supporters. He cultivated relationships with everyone from nobility to freedmen, understanding that in Rome's complex social hierarchy, power could flow from unexpected sources. His charm was legendary, but it was always deployed with purpose. His personal life became as much a part of his legend as his public acts. Stories of his affairs with noblewomen circulated widely, including a scandalous relationship with Mucia, the wife of Pompey. When caught in compromising situations, Caesar showed an almost supernatural ability to turn potential disgrace into advantage. After being named in the divorce proceedings of Pompey's lieutenant Publius Clodius Pulcher, he famously declared that his wife must be above suspicion and divorced her, despite having no evidence of her guilt. By 63 BCE, Caesar had achieved enough prominence to be elected Pontifex Maximus, high priest of the Roman state religion. The election was remarkable not only for Caesar's relative youth, but for the way he won it. Competing against two much more senior candidates, he borrowed vast sums to bribe voters, telling his mother on election morning that he would return as Pontifex Maximus, or not at all. He was gambling his entire future on a single election. If he lost, his debts would force him into exile. He won. This combination of reckless gambling and careful calculation would characterize Caesar's entire career. He seemed to understand instinctively that in a society as hidebound as Rome, genuine change could only come through shocking the system. Each scandal, each unprecedented act, each break with tradition served to make the next one easier, gradually expanding the boundaries of what was politically possible. Yet beneath the calculated outrageousness lay serious purpose. Caesar was building not just a career, but a new kind of political power, one based on personal loyalty rather than traditional authority. His followers were devoted to him not because of his family name or his official position, but because he seemed to represent something new, a force for change in a system desperately in need of reform. The pirates who had dismissed him as just another wealthy Roman had failed to recognize what Caesar already knew. He was destined for something extraordinary. By the end of his 30s, he had established himself as one of Rome's most prominent political figures, but his greatest achievements and his greatest controversies still lay ahead. The legend he had so carefully crafted would soon be tested on larger stages, as Caesar prepared to reach for powers no Roman had ever dared to grasp. The die had not yet been cast, but the player was now ready for a game with much higher stakes. Rome would never be the same. Chapter 3. The First Triumvirate. In the winter of 60 BCE, three men met in secret to reshape the Roman world. One was Rome's wealthiest citizen, Marcus Licinius Crassus, who had made his fortune buying the property of Sulla's victims at fire sale prices. Another was Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, Pompey the Great Rome's most celebrated general, fresh from conquering much of the East. The third was Gaius Julius Caesar, drowning in debt but rich in ambition, who had orchestrated this unlikely alliance. The meeting itself was unprecedented. Crassus and Pompey detested each other. They had been rivals since their youth, their mutual hatred deepening during their joint consulship in 70 BCE. Yet Caesar had managed to convince them that their individual interest would be better served by collaboration than competition. It was a masterpiece of political manipulation that would change the course of Roman history. Men of their standing, Cato the Younger would later declare, do not meet by accident. He was right. The alliance, soon to be known as the First Triumvirate, was Caesar's solution to a political deadlock that threatened to derail his career. His creditors were closing in, and his enemies in the Senate, led by Marcus Porcius Cato, were determined to block his bid for the consulship. He needed both Crassus's wealth and Pompey's influence to achieve his ambitions. The terms of their agreement were simple but revolutionary. Each man would support the other's political objectives. Pompey wanted land for his veterans and ratification of his eastern settlements. Crassus sought tax relief for his business associates in Asia. Caesar wanted the consulship and a provincial command that would allow him to achieve military glory and, not incidentally, pay off his massive debts. The alliance was sealed with more than just promises. Caesar arranged for his daughter Julia, just 20 years old, to marry Pompey, who was nearly 30 years her senior. It was a classic Roman political marriage, but it would prove to be something more. Pompey, to everyone's surprise, including perhaps his own, fell deeply in love with his young bride. The immediate impact of the triumvirate was dramatic. Caesar won the consulship for 59 BCE, despite the best efforts of the Optimates to block him. His colleague was Marcus Calpurnius Bibulus, a rigid conservative backed by the Senate's traditional leadership. They hoped Bibulus would act as a check on Caesar's ambitions. They had no idea what they were dealing with. Caesar's consulship was a masterclass in political revolution through technically legal means. When Bibulus attempted to obstruct legislation by declaring unfavorable religious omens, a standard political tactic in Rome, Caesar simply ignored him. When Bibulus resorted to physical obstruction, Caesar's supporters dumped a bucket of sewage over him in the Forum. After that, Bibulus retreated to his home, emerging only to declare each day religiously unfavorable for public business. Wits began dating documents not to the consulship of Caesar and Bibulus, but to the consulship of Julius and Caesar. The legislation Caesar rammed through was revolutionary. He pushed through Pompey's provisions for his veterans and eastern settlements. He secured better terms for Crassus's tax collectors. He passed an agrarian law redistributing public land to the urban poor and veterans. Each law was technically legal, but passed through unprecedented strong-arm tactics that made a mockery of traditional republican procedures. The Senate's response vacillated between impotent rage and stunned disbelief. Cato once spoke for an entire day to delay a vote until Caesar had him dragged from the Senate House. When other senators protested, Caesar threatened to have them arrested. "I will make you a private citizen," one senator warned Caesar. "That would take half a legion," Caesar replied with a smile. Yet even as he strong-armed the political establishment, Caesar worked to maintain his popularity with the masses. He ordered the daily acts of the Senate to be published, making political decisions more transparent than ever before. He established Rome's first daily newspaper, the Acta Diurna, posted in the Forum. Every humiliation of the traditional elite was staged to appeal to popular resentment of senatorial privilege. The culmination of Caesar's consulship was the securing of his next command. He was assigned the governorship of Cisalpine and Transalpine Gaul for 5 years. The Senate, eager to see him leave Rome, agreed to this unprecedented term. Cato, almost alone, recognized the danger. A 5-year command would give Caesar time to build an army personally loyal to him. "You have nourished a wolf cub," he warned his colleagues. "Now you must live with the wolf." As Caesar prepared to depart for Gaul, he took steps to secure his position in Rome. He arranged for Publius Clodius Pulcher, a radical populist, to be adopted into a plebeian family so he could serve as tribune of the plebs. Clodius would protect Caesar's interests in his absence, and not incidentally, drive his enemies into exile. The triumvirate seemed at the height of its power, but fractures were already appearing. Pompey was growing uncomfortable with Caesar's methods, if not his aims. Crassus was jealous of Pompey's greater influence. Both men were beginning to realize that their junior partner was outmaneuvering them both. As Caesar rode north toward Gaul in early 58 BCE, he left behind a transformed political landscape. The traditional checks and balances of the republican system had been exposed as paper tigers before the combination of popular support, military backing, and political ruthlessness. The republic still stood, but its foundations had been shaken. Caesar had proved himself a master of political warfare. Now he would have the chance to prove himself on real battlefields. Gaul awaited, and with it the opportunity to build the army that would make him not just an influential politician, but master of Rome itself. The Republic's crisis was about to enter its final phase. The wolf was loose. Chapter 4. Conquest of Gaul. In the spring of 58 BCE, as Caesar journeyed toward his new province, he received urgent news that would change the course of history. The Helvetii, a powerful Celtic tribe from what is now Switzerland, were on the move, all of them. An entire nation of 368,000 people, by Caesar's count, had burned their homes and were marching west, intending to migrate through Roman territory. For a different governor, this might have been seen as a crisis. For Caesar, it was an opportunity. He had left Rome with only a single legion. Within days of receiving the news, he had raised 2 more from local recruits. By the time he intercepted the Helvetii near modern-day Geneva, he had cobbled together an army strong enough to block their passage. When they tried an alternate route, he pursued them with a speed that would become legendary, covering 50 miles a day until he caught and destroyed them at Bibracte. The battle revealed Caesar's military genius. Outnumbered more than 2 to 1, he turned the Helvetii's own wagon train against them, using it to protect his flanks while his disciplined legionaries broke their charge. By day's end, the Helvetii were destroyed as a military force. Caesar ordered the survivors to return home. They would serve as a buffer against Germanic tribes. But the message had been sent. A new power had arrived in Gaul. Over the next 8 years, Caesar would demonstrate not just military brilliance, but an almost supernatural ability to turn crisis into opportunity. When the Gallic tribes begged for his help against an invasion of Germans led by Ariovistus, he seized the chance to extend Roman influence deeper into Gaul. When the Belgic tribes in the north formed an anti-Roman alliance, he used it as justification to conquer them. Each campaign broadened the scope of the next, in an expanding spiral of conquest that would eventually encompass all of Gaul. His methods were as innovative as they were effective. Caesar revolutionized Roman military engineering, building bridges across the Rhine in 10 days and siege works around Alesia that stretched for miles. He created a personal intelligence network that kept him informed of tribal politics across Gaul. Most importantly, he transformed the Roman legion into the most effective fighting force the world had yet seen. Caesar's legionaries adored him. He knew many by name, shared their hardships, and led from the front. At critical moments in battle, he would snatch a shield from a soldier and charge into the front lines himself, shaming his men into following. "Come on, comrades!" he would shout. "This is my last battle!" It never was, but his men fought as if it might be. The campaigns made for gripping reading back in Rome, thanks to Caesar's masterful commentaries on the Gallic War. Written in elegant, seemingly straightforward Latin, the commentaries were a propaganda masterpiece. Caesar portrayed himself as a reluctant conqueror, forced by circumstances and loyalty to Rome's allies to take on ever greater commitments. That these circumstances invariably led to the expansion of his power was presented as mere coincidence. His descriptions of the Gauls walked a careful line. They were formidable enough that defeating them brought glory, but barbaric enough that conquering them was justified. His account of their customs and society was detailed enough to satisfy intellectual curiosity while emphasizing their need for Roman civilization. The commentaries were not just a military record, but a justification for empire. The scale of Caesar's achievements was staggering. In 8 years, he conquered 3 million square miles of territory, defeated 3 million enemies by his count, captured 800 cities, and subdued 300 tribes. He led the first Roman expeditions across both the Rhine into Germania and the Channel into Britain. His men built fortresses, bridges, and harbors across Gaul, laying the foundation for centuries of Roman rule. The human cost was equally enormous. By Caesar's own account, probably understated, over 1 million Gauls died. Another million were enslaved. Entire tribes were wiped out, their names surviving only in his commentaries. The Gaul that emerged from his conquests was forever transformed, its ancient Celtic civilization replaced by Gallo-Roman culture. Yet Caesar's greatest challenges came not from the Gauls, but from Rome itself. His enemies in the Senate, led by Cato, tried repeatedly to have him recalled. They were outraged not just by his unauthorized wars of conquest, but by the way he used the spoils of war to build political support. Gold from Gaul flowed into Rome, buying influence and loyalty. Caesar's winter quarters near Ravenna became a second political capital, where ambitious young Romans sought appointments to his staff. The decisive moment came in 52 BCE, when Vercingetorix united most of the Gallic tribes in a last bid for freedom. The revolt spread with devastating speed. Roman settlers were massacred, allied tribes switched sides, and for the first time, Caesar faced the possibility of losing everything. His response showcased both his genius and his ruthlessness. Racing across Gaul with his cavalry in winter, he rallied loyal allies and surprised his enemies. When Vercingetorix took refuge in the hilltop fortress of Alesia, Caesar built 2 rings of fortifications, one facing in to besiege the defenders, another facing out to repel the relief army. When food ran out in Alesia, Vercingetorix expelled the women and children. Caesar refused to let them pass his lines, leaving them to starve in the no-man's land between the armies. The siege of Alesia was Caesar's masterpiece of military engineering and psychological warfare. When a massive Gallic relief army finally arrived, his outnumbered forces defeated them in a series of desperate battles. Vercingetorix surrendered and was sent to Rome in chains, to be executed 6 years later in Caesar's triumph. By 50 BCE, Gaul was pacified. Caesar had created a personal army of unprecedented loyalty and effectiveness. His veterans had served together for years, developing tactics and techniques that made them nearly invincible. More importantly, they were loyal to him personally, not to Rome. They sang ribald songs about their commander's sexual conquests and repeated stories of his victories. They were Caesar's men, not Rome's. He would soon need their loyalty. While Caesar was conquering Gaul, the political situation in Rome had deteriorated. The triumvirate had collapsed following the death of Crassus against the Parthians in 53 BCE. Julia's death in childbirth had broken the personal bond between Caesar and Pompey. His enemies in the Senate were moving to strip him of his command before he could stand for consul again. Caesar's conquest of Gaul had given him the resources, money, allies, and above all, a loyal army to defend himself. But using those resources would mean civil war. As he contemplated his options at Ravenna in the winter of 49 BCE, he could not have known that his greatest victories and his greatest tragedy still lay ahead. The die was not yet cast, but the player's hand was reaching. Chapter 5: Civil War Erupts. The year 50 BCE began with an impossible demand. The Senate, led by Caesar's implacable enemy Cato, ordered him to lay down his command and return to Rome as a private citizen. The same decree permitted Pompey to retain his armies. The message was clear: return defenseless to face your enemies, or become an enemy of the state. "They want to take me down like a wounded wild animal," Caesar wrote to a friend. The metaphor was apt. For 9 years, he had transformed Gaul into a personal power base, his influence growing along with his military success. Now his opponents hoped to strip him of both the immunity of command and the army that guaranteed his safety. The political crisis had been building for years. The death of Crassus in Parthia had removed the triumvirate's balancing force. Julia's death in childbirth had severed the personal bond between Caesar and Pompey. Most crucially, Pompey had drifted back into alliance with the conservative Optimates, who now looked to him to check Caesar's growing power. The immediate issue was timing. Caesar's governorship of Gaul would expire before he could stand for consul again, leaving him vulnerable to prosecution by his enemies. He requested permission to stand for the consulship in absentia, a privilege previously granted to Pompey. The Senate's refusal made their intentions clear. They wanted Caesar powerless before them in the courts. Through the year, negotiations proceeded while both sides prepared for war. Caesar offered compromises. He would surrender part of his army and province if he could retain enough force to guarantee his safety. His supporters in Rome, led by Mark Antony and Curio, proposed that both Caesar and Pompey lay down their commands simultaneously. The Senate, increasingly under the sway of Caesar's most militant opponents, rejected every offer. On January 7, 49 BCE, the Senate passed the ultimate decree, the Roman equivalent of martial law, and ordered Caesar to disband his army immediately or be declared an enemy of the state. When Mark Antony and his fellow tribunes vetoed the decree, they were driven from the Senate House, fleeing Rome disguised as slaves. Their flight gave Caesar what he needed, a constitutional pretext for military action. The news reached Caesar at Ravenna, where he had positioned the 13th Legion within striking distance of Italy. He gathered his officers to read them the reports from Rome, along with a passionate speech about the violation of the tribune's sacred rights. The real message was clear. It was time to choose between him and the Senate. What followed was political theater at its finest. Caesar sent one last peace proposal to Rome, knowing it would be rejected. He dined publicly with friends, attended a gladiatorial show and inspected a training ground, all to project normalcy. Then, as darkness fell, he slipped away with a small group of officers toward the Rubicon River, the boundary of his province. The famous crossing was both a legal boundary and a psychological one. No Roman general had ever led troops across this river against the Republic. According to Suetonius, Caesar paused at the river's edge, telling his companions, "Even yet, we may turn back. But once we cross that little bridge, we must fight it out with arms." The decision to cross sparked one of history's great civil wars, but its opening phase was remarkably bloodless. Caesar's speed and boldness caught his opponents completely off guard. Town after town in northern Italy opened their gates to him. His policy of clemency toward captured opponents, unprecedented in Roman civil wars, encouraged others to surrender rather than resist. Pompey, despite having boasted that he could raise armies by stamping his foot in Italy, retreated southward. His forces were larger but scattered and untested. Caesar's veteran legions, hardened by years of combat in Gaul, were clearly superior to Pompey's hastily raised recruits. When Caesar reached Corfinium, the first major city to resist him, its commander Domitius Ahenobarbus surrendered after his own troops refused to fight. Caesar's treatment of Domitius set the tone for the entire civil war. Rather than execute him, as was customary in civil conflicts, Caesar pardoned him and even returned his personal wealth. "I shall adopt a new method of conquest," he declared, "and fortify myself with mercy and generosity." It was both genuine policy and brilliant propaganda. Each act of clemency made resistance seem not just futile but unreasonable. The campaign became a race for Rome itself. Pompey, recognizing he couldn't hold Italy with his current forces, decided to withdraw to Greece. There, he could gather armies from the eastern provinces and starve Italy into submission with his control of the sea. It was strategically sound but politically disastrous. The sight of Rome's greatest general abandoning Italy to Caesar dealt a devastating blow to his cause. Caesar entered Rome as its master, but worked to maintain legal forms. He addressed the Senate respectfully, portrayed himself as the defender of Republican liberty against a factional conspiracy, and took pains to avoid the appearance of a military dictatorship. When he accessed the state treasury over the opposition of a young tribune named Metellus, he insisted he was securing it from Pompey's supporters rather than seizing it for himself. But he couldn't linger in Rome. Pompey's strongest forces were in Spain, and Caesar knew they had to be defeated before he could safely pursue Pompey himself to Greece. "I go to fight an army without a leader," he declared, "and then I will fight a leader without an army." The Spanish campaign revealed Caesar at his military best. Outnumbered and cut off from supplies, he outmaneuvered Pompey's lieutenants through a combination of bold strategy and innovative engineering. He built canals, diverted rivers, and conducted lightning marches that left his opponents baffled. When battle was finally joined at Ilerda, he forced Pompey's armies to surrender without a major battle. By the end of 49 BCE, Caesar controlled Italy, Gaul, and Spain. His policy of clemency had undermined support for his opponents while swelling his own ranks with pardoned enemies. But the decisive battle still loomed. Pompey had used the time to gather massive forces in Greece, 9 full legions plus auxiliary troops from across the eastern provinces. As winter approached, Caesar prepared for what would be the greatest gamble of his career: a winter crossing of the Adriatic to attack Pompey's numerically superior forces. The Republic's fate would be decided on the plains of Greece, where 2 of history's greatest generals would finally face each other in battle. The Civil War had transformed from a political crisis into a contest for empire, though few yet recognized it. The Republic's institutions continued to function, but real power now flowed from the armies in the field. Whether Caesar or Pompey emerged victorious, Rome would never be the same. The tensions between the North and South reached a boiling point, leading to the outbreak of the Civil War. This conflict would shape the future of the United States, testing its resilience and Chapter 6, Master of Rome. On a winter night in 48 BCE, Caesar stood on the deck of a small fisherman's boat in a raging storm off the coast of Epirus. His army was stranded on the Italian coast, blocked by Pompey's superior fleet. Growing impatient, Caesar had tried to cross in disguise to lead them himself. Now, as waves threatened to swamp the tiny vessel, the frightened captain wanted to turn back. "Fear not," Caesar told him. "You carry Caesar and his fortune." The boat eventually had to return to port, but the episode illustrated both Caesar's impatience with delay and his unshakable belief in his own destiny. Within weeks, he had managed to slip enough troops across the Adriatic to establish a beachhead. The decisive phase of the Civil War was about to begin. The campaign that followed showcased both Caesar's brilliance and his capacity for near-catastrophic risk-taking. Outnumbered nearly 2-1, he tried to trap Pompey's army at Dyrrhachium. The plan backfired spectacularly. Pompey broke through his lines, inflicting the worst defeat of Caesar's career. Any other general would have retreated to regroup. Caesar advanced deeper into Greece. His army was starving, outnumbered, and far from its supply lines, but Caesar understood psychology better than logistics. He knew Pompey's senatorial allies were pressing him to end the war with a decisive battle. By appearing vulnerable, he could lure his more cautious opponent into the kind of direct confrontation Pompey wanted to avoid. The strategy worked. On August 9th, 48 BCE, the 2 armies met on the plains of Pharsalus. Pompey's plan was sound: use his superior cavalry to crush Caesar's right flank, then roll up his outnumbered infantry. But Caesar had anticipated this. He placed his best legion in reserve and trained them to use their spears against cavalry rather than throw them, an innovation that would prove decisive. When Pompey's cavalry charged, they were met with a wall of spear points aimed at their faces. They broke, retreated, and crashed into their own infantry. Caesar's veteran legionaries, sensing victory, surged forward. By day's end, Pompey's army had disintegrated. The great general fled to Egypt, where he would be murdered by order of the young king Ptolemy XIII. Caesar followed Pompey to Alexandria, arriving days after his death. He wept when presented with his old friend's head and ordered the murderers executed. But sentiment didn't prevent him from involving himself in Egyptian politics, a decision that would lead to one of the most famous love affairs in history. The young Cleopatra, locked in a civil war with her brother Ptolemy, had herself smuggled into Caesar's quarters, rolled in a carpet. Whether she seduced him or he her is irrelevant. They became lovers, and Caesar threw Rome's support behind her claim to Egypt's throne. The decision sparked an uprising in Alexandria that nearly killed them both. The Alexandria War showed Caesar at his most audacious. Trapped in the palace with only a few thousand men, he held off the entire Alexandrian army while waiting for reinforcements. He burned the Egyptian fleet in the harbor, inadvertently destroying part of the Great Library. When finally pressed to the wall, he swam through the harbor under enemy fire to rally his forces, holding his famous purple cloak above the water with his teeth to keep it dry. Victory in Egypt confirmed Caesar as the master of the Roman world, but his enemies weren't finished. While he dallied with Cleopatra, their affair produced a son. Caesarion Pompey's sons raised new armies in Africa. Caesar's lightning campaign against them culminated in the Battle of Thapsus, where he inflicted devastating casualties on an army that included Cato and other Republican leaders. Cato's suicide after the battle marked the end of principled resistance to Caesar's power. The remaining Pompeian forces in Spain, led by Pompey's sons, were little more than bandits with an army. Caesar crushed them at Munda in 45 BCE, in what he called his hardest-fought battle. Now undisputed master of Rome, Caesar began the work of rebuilding. His program was ambitious: land reform, debt relief, citizenship for provincials, reorganization of local government, and even reform of the calendar. He pardoned his enemies, promoted capable men regardless of birth, and worked to heal the Civil War's divisions. But it was his handling of power that would prove fatal. Caesar seemed unable to decide whether to be a democratic leader or an absolute monarch. He rejected the title of king but accepted increasingly extravagant honors. He was named dictator for life. His image appeared on coins, the first living Roman so honored, and he was officially deified as the divine Julius. His behavior became increasingly regal. He wore purple robes, traditional garb of kings. He refused to stand when the Senate entered his presence. When Mark Antony tried to crown him king during the Lupercalia festival, Caesar refused, but many thought with insufficient conviction. Most dangerously, he began planning grand new conquests, a war against Parthia to avenge Crassus, followed perhaps by circumnavigation of the Black Sea and invasion of Germany from the east. The campaigns would keep him away from Rome for years, during which he would need to retain his extraordinary powers. The contradiction was becoming clear. Caesar was simultaneously trying to restore the Republic and transform it into something new. He wanted to be both a populist reformer and an absolute ruler, both a preserver of Roman traditions and their revolutionary transformer. His enemies saw more clearly than he did that this circle couldn't be squared. The Republic's institutions couldn't coexist with an individual wielding absolute power, no matter how benevolently. Something would have to give. As the Ides of March approached in 44 BCE, Caesar was at the height of his power, but also at his most vulnerable. He had dismissed his Spanish bodyguard, declaring that it was better to die once than live in constant fear. He ignored warnings about plots against his life, including those from his wife Calpurnia. The master of Rome had succumbed to hubris, the belief that his destiny made him invulnerable. He was about to discover that even gods can. Chapter 7. The Ides of March. On March 15th, 44 BCE, Caesar's friend Decimus Brutus arrived at his home to escort him to the Senate. The dictator had been planning to stay home, troubled by his wife Calpurnia's nightmares of disaster. But Decimus mocked these superstitions and reminded Caesar that the Senate was waiting to grant him new honors. Would you have them say that they assembled to grant honors to Caesar, but Caesar didn't think them worth getting up for? It was a masterful piece of manipulation. Decimus knew his friend's psychology. Caesar's pride would not allow him to seem fearful or disrespectful of the Senate. What Caesar didn't know was that Decimus was one of 60 conspirators waiting to kill him. The plot against Caesar had been months in the making. Its leaders were a study in contradictions. Marcus Brutus, whose family claimed descent from the legendary founder of the Republic, Gaius Cassius Longinus, a brilliant military commander who had served under Caesar, and Decimus himself, one of Caesar's most trusted lieutenants. Some were former enemies Caesar had pardoned, others were friends he had promoted to high office. Their motives were equally complex. Some, like Cassius, seemed to have been driven by personal ambition. Others, like Brutus, convinced themselves they were acting to save the Republic from tyranny. All of them had prospered under Caesar's rule, but all had come to see him as a threat to everything they believed Rome should be. The immediate catalyst was the news that Caesar planned to leave Rome in March for a 3-year campaign against Parthia. Before leaving, he intended to be named king outside of Italy, a title he had previously rejected within Rome itself. To the conspirators, this seemed confirmation that he intended to establish a permanent autocracy. The plot was breathtaking in its complexity and risk. 60 men had to keep the secret. The assassination had to be public enough to seem like an act of state rather than murder, yet controlled enough to succeed. Most crucially, Caesar's veteran legions had to be prevented from taking immediate revenge. As Caesar entered the Senate House, everything seemed normal. The conspirators had positioned themselves carefully. Some would delay Mark Antony outside, preventing Caesar's strongest supporter from intervening. Others would present a petition, crowding around Caesar to prevent his escape. Tullius Cimber approached first, grabbing Caesar's toga. This was the signal. Casca struck the first blow, but his hand trembled and the wound was slight. Caesar reacted with his characteristic fighting spirit, pulling free and preparing to defend himself. Then he saw Brutus among his attackers. "You too, my child?" he asked in Greek. The words, if truly spoken, revealed both his shock at Brutus's betrayal and his lifelong habit of theatrical self-awareness. Even in death, Caesar was conscious of creating a scene worthy of history. He pulled his toga over his face and stopped resisting. The conspirators struck so eagerly that they wounded each other in their frenzy. Caesar fell at the base of Pompey's statue, which he had magnanimously restored after his victory in the Civil War. He had received 23 wounds, but only one was fatal. The assassins had planned the murder meticulously. They had not planned what would happen next. They rushed from the Senate House, brandishing their bloody daggers, expecting the crowd to cheer the Republic's restoration. Instead, they met a shocked silence. Rome's citizens locked themselves in their homes, uncertain what the assassination meant for the city's stability. Mark Antony, who might have been killed had he entered the Senate House, showed unexpected political skill. He secured Caesar's papers and money, then orchestrated a public funeral that would change everything. His famous oration, immortalized and reinvented by Shakespeare, transformed the crowd's shock into rage. The conspirators had to flee Rome. Caesar's death sparked another civil war, but not the one the conspirators had expected. Instead of the Republic being restored, the Roman world was divided between Caesar's designated heir, his 18-year-old great-nephew Octavian, and his former lieutenant Mark Antony. The two would first cooperate to destroy Caesar's assassins, then fight each other for supreme power. The aftermath revealed how completely Caesar had transformed Roman politics. No one seriously attempted to restore the old republican system. The only question was what form the new autocracy would take. Octavian, showing political genius that matched his adopted father's, would eventually win sole power and establish the system we know as the Roman Empire. Caesar's lasting impact was immense. His conquests in Gaul created the basis for French and much of Western European civilization. His political reforms, though many were reversed after his death, set patterns that would be revived by later emperors. His writings influenced military and political thinking for centuries. Most importantly, he created an archetype of leadership that would echo through history. Every subsequent Roman emperor took the name Caesar. So did the German Kaisers and Russian Tsars. His name became synonymous with supreme authority. Napoleon studied his campaigns. Mussolini modeled his image on Caesar's. Modern leaders still quote him and invoke his example. Yet Caesar's true legacy is more complex than simple autocracy. He represented a new kind of leadership, personal rather than institutional, based on popularity rather than tradition, promising reform rather than stability. His career showed both the possibilities and dangers of such leadership. The republic that Caesar destroyed was already dying, corrupted by inequality, violence, and the inability to govern an empire with institutions designed for a city-state. But the system he created in its place was unstable, relying too much on the abilities of a single extraordinary individual. In the end, Caesar's death matched his life in dramatic impact. Like a true populist autocrat, he claimed to serve the people while accumulating personal power. Like many reformers, he believed that only he could fix a broken system. Like many brilliant men, he underestimated both his opponent's resolve and his own vulnerability. The historians Suetonius and Plutarch claim that Caesar welcomed his assassination, preferring a swift death to the slow decline of age. Whether true or not, it was the kind of death that suited him, dramatic, public, and world-changing. He died as he had lived, at the center of events, creating scenes that would be remembered for millennia. The Republic died with Caesar, though its forms would continue under the emperors. A new age was born, an age of personal rule, of professional armies, of empire. Future generations would debate whether Caesar was hero or villain, savior or destroyer. But none could deny that he changed the world. The die had been cast. The game was over. But its consequences would echo through the epilogue, Divus Julius. 2 years after Caesar's assassination, a comet blazed across Rome's summer sky for 7 straight days. Octavian, Caesar's adopted son and heir, declared it the soul of his deified father ascending to join the gods. The timing was perfect. The Senate had officially declared Caesar a god, and now the heavens themselves seemed to confirm it. The comet was a propaganda masterpiece, but it reflected a deeper truth. Caesar had already transcended mere humanity. Even before his death, he had become something more than a man, a symbol, an archetype, a name that would echo through millennia. The transformation of Gaius Julius Caesar into Divus Julius, the divine Julius, was just the beginning. The immediate aftermath of Caesar's death revealed how completely he had transformed Roman politics. The conspirators who killed him in the name of the Republic succeeded only in triggering a new and bloodier civil war. At Philippi in 42 BCE, Brutus and Cassius were defeated by the combined forces of Octavian and Mark Antony. Both committed suicide, discovering too late that killing Caesar was easier than killing what he represented. The victors soon fell out among themselves. The final showdown came at Actium in 31 BCE, where Octavian defeated the combined forces of Antony and Cleopatra. With this victory, Caesar's heir became the undisputed master of the Roman world. Taking the name Augustus, he would create a new political system, the Roman Empire, built on the foundations his adopted father had laid. Augustus proved shrewder than Caesar in handling supreme power. He maintained republican facades while holding real authority, called himself princeps, first citizen, rather than dictator, and carefully avoided any hint of wanting to be king. But the system he created was based on Caesar's fundamental insight that the Roman world had outgrown its republican institutions and needed a single ruler. Every subsequent Roman emperor would take the name Caesar as a title, transforming it from a family name into a synonym for supreme authority. When the Roman Empire finally fell in the West, new rulers rushed to claim Caesar's mantle. The German kings styled themselves Kaiser, the Russian rulers took the title Tsar, both derivatives of Caesar. Even the Ottoman sultans claimed to be the heirs of Caesar's empire. Caesar's military innovations proved equally influential. His commentaries on the Gallic and Civil Wars became required reading for generals through the ages. Napoleon studied his campaigns obsessively, noting how Caesar combined political acumen with military genius. Modern military academies still teach his principles of speed, surprise, and concentration of force. His literary influence was no less profound. Caesar's prose style, clear, direct, and seemingly objective, while masterfully manipulative, created a new standard for political communication. His commentaries invented a genre of political military memoir that leaders still emulate. Even his famous habit of referring to himself in the third person has been copied by countless politicians and generals. The physical impact of his conquests shaped European civilization. The France that emerged in the Middle Ages was built on the foundations of Caesar's Gaul. The Rhine frontier he established between Roman and Germanic territory would define European cultural boundaries for centuries. Cities he founded, from London, Londinium to Lyon, Lugdunum, became major European capitals. Yet Caesar's most lasting influence may be as a cautionary tale about the price of political ambition. Shakespeare's play Julius Caesar, still performed after 4 centuries, uses his assassination to explore timeless questions about loyalty, republicanism, and the costs of political violence. Modern debates about populism, democratic decay, and the rise of strongmen leaders often invoke Caesar's example. His career illustrated eternal political dilemmas: reform versus stability, popularity versus legitimacy, personal power versus institutional authority. He showed how a republic can die through the very mechanisms designed to preserve it, and how popular support can enable the destruction of popular government. These lessons remain relevant in every era. Even the manner of his death became archetypal. Beware the Ides of March entered the language as a warning about the price of hubris. Caesar's last words, "Et tu, Brute," in Shakespeare's version became shorthand for the ultimate betrayal. His assassination set the pattern for centuries of political murders, each new Brutus claiming to strike against tyranny. 2 millennia after his death, Caesar remains a figure of fascination and controversy. To some, he was a necessary reformer who transformed an oligarchic republic into a more efficient empire. To others, he was a tyrant who destroyed ancient liberties for personal power. The debate is ultimately irrelevant. His impact transcended such judgments. In the end, Caesar's greatest creation may have been himself, the figure he crafted through his writing, his actions, and his theatrical sense of history. He understood that lasting power depends on lasting fame, that stories matter as much as victories, that how one is remembered can matter more than what one actually did. The comet that marked Caesar's deification has been identified by modern astronomers as C/43K1, one of the brightest comets in recorded history. It was visible for 7 days in July 44 BCE, exactly as ancient sources claimed. But whether it was really Caesar's soul ascending to the heavens is beside the point. The story was believed because Caesar had already achieved immortality in the only way that really matters, by permanently changing how humans think about power, leadership, and the possibilities of individual action. The die had been cast. The player was gone. But the game he started continues to this day, wherever ambitious individuals dream of reshaping the world through the force of their will. Ave Caesar, the king is dead, but kingship endures.